Finally, on Oahu, Kauhikaipu, sorry, out on the east end, almost in the lee of Rabbit Island, but not quite. It's still pretty exposed. Had quite a unique environment, and entirely different from Kapapa, which is, I don't know if any of you have ever dived outside of Kapapa, but it's nothing like anywhere in Kaneohe Bay. It's very gradually sloping and also very highly exposed to general wave and groundswell turbulence. Okay, so what we found, first of all, in the reconnaissance surveys, here's a profile of the total taxa, most of which were identified two species. By far the greater number were identified two species, and we found a total of nearly 1,500 taxa throughout the entire study, with ranges at each site ranging from about 120 to about 185. And the maximum total invertebrates were found at Po'opo'o and Afalanai. The second highest number and maximum number of fish species or taxa were found at Naumoku off of Molokai from the Kalapapa Park. And the maximum algae occurred at Hulu and Kapapa, Hulu being one of the northern islets off of Maui. I mean, take all the presence-absence data and put it into a source and similarity analysis. It comes out with kind of a nice pattern that you can see that the two South Lanai sites group very nicely together. Kaimi and Hulu, the two northern Maui sites, were grouped together along with Kapapa, having both of them exposed to high wave and groundswell turbulence. The three Molokai sites grouped together, and finally Kauhikaipu off of east end of Molokai, off of Oahu, grouped with the Molokini Rim site. Well, looking at the transect data, we can get more specific idea of what the abundances and distribution by size classes were. The maximum coral were found at Molokini, which is what we would have expected, but surprising to us, the second highest on the average was at Kapapa Island. I would not have expected that to be a high coral area, but it in fact is. The substratum was mostly hard substratum, hard limestone, except at Po'opo'o, which for some reason, even though it's in all respects similar to Pu'upe'e in its characteristics and exposure, had a very high sediment environment. You can see the sediment value is up to nearly 90% at one of the two transects. So that site was extremely different in its general substratum and environmental characteristics. The maximum algae occurred at Kaimi, one of the two North Maui sites, and we'll come back to that. That was due primarily to one or two species. The maximum calcareous and cyanobacteria were at Molokini. Fortunately, cyanobacteria were a relatively small portion of the total algal community at all sites. Looking at each site, the first transect at each of the sites quickly, this is how the size distribution of corals at Po'opo'o compared with Pu'upe'e. You can see a lot fewer species with the size class mostly in the next to the smallest category of 1 to 2 centimeters diameter. And these are back calculated from the areas. So they are an average estimate for an irregular shape, but I think it's by far the most reliable way to get to this type of data. I don't have any confidence in my own ability to go out with a stick and go along 25 or a transect however long and get a good estimate of what is there. I believe that this method is one I'd like to promote because I think it is going to be reliable. It's time consuming in the laboratory, but you can train someone with very little time who can then be turned loose on this. So in terms of the coral coverage at Pu'upe'e, you see a much more diverse, generally much larger size class range, and a coverage of 20% compared to only about 2% at Po'opo'o. So very much difference between the two sites. Here are the three Maui sites. On the Molokini Rim, you have the highest coral coverage. We also have the incidence, which you can't see too well in this picture, of a red sponge, which we're calling Clathria sp, which we will see at another site. But that was by far the most typically pristine coral environment in terms of diversity and abundance, especially of the pocilloporids. On the northern shore, quite a different situation. You can see this is what it looked like at the Kaimi site, where this Dictyopterus australis and Dictyota were extremely high abundance on the general hard boulder and cobble substratum there, compared to Hulu, where there was very little algae and more highly covered by reef coral. On Molokai and Kalapapa, the two islands sites around the edge from the park were, again, entirely the same environment. Both of them, the transects and surveys, reconnaissance were done on the leeward sides during rather rough conditions. Only about 2 kilometers difference between them, but entirely different results in the general structure of the dominant organisms. At Mokapu, you see there's very high abundance of this red Clathria sponge. It was by far the dominant organism on the transects, whereas at Okakala, further inshore, it was very much dominated by Sinularia densa, and also from a zoanthid, Palithoa caesia. Around the edge, coming back close to the harbor, you can see a very high coral coverage, dominated principally by Pocillopora meandrina and Pocillopora mollikensis. And finally, on Oahu, the biggest surprise is a very diverse coral community, 2 species which we didn't find elsewhere, being Montipora flabellata and Pavona dwardeni. They've in fact provided much of the structure. Mostly this was very flat. Most of these corals were just encrusting or low-lying humps, and yet this coverage was very high. They had much higher average diameters at this site than any others that we looked at. At Keauhekaipu, off the east end, a more typical environment for reef corals with a lot of ledges. Rugosity was high, and what I would more have expected to find at many of our sites and didn't. Finally, on fish transect biomass, and I thank Ivor Williams for the analysis that he did for us after I gently twisted his arm, because he certainly had no commitment to do so. I really much appreciate it, because it comes up with some of the most interesting information that came out of the study. The highest total primary consumers and target species occurred at Kapapa Island, interestingly, very interestingly. And the highest secondary consumers were, second highest were at Kapapa, and the highest were at Keauhekaipu. So we're seeing this wide array of sites, one of which, Pu'upei, is in a marine MLCD, and is having much the lowest values. That here at these sites on Oahu, rich and highly abundant, by comparison at least to others, fish community. The highest apex predators occurred at Molokini, one might expect that, and at Nomoko, and that site that's just outside of Kalapapa Harbor. Lowest at Po'opo'o, as I said, where this is probably has much to do with the substratum being mostly a sand and silt environment there, but also not much higher at nearby Pu'upei in the MLCD. And of course, Molokini is also an MLCD and didn't show very much outstanding fish abundance except in the top predator level.